Afternoon, everybody. I am very much looking forward to today's presentation with Professor Modiri, who has graciously accepted our invitation to present at our indexing transformation seminars that happen every 2 weeks. Professor Modiri is Head of Department of Jurisprudence at the University of Pretoria in the Faculty of Law. His main research and teaching interests are in the fields of critical race theory, global Black political thought, and African philosophy. His current research project centers on the Black radical tradition in its African and diasporic articulations and intersects under two significant umbrellas, that of constitutional abolitionism and Azanian critical theory. He is currently working on a monograph on Black consciousness as a critique of post-apartheid political rationalities and mythologies. I have been closely following his work for the past in my research and my interest on critical race theory, particularly race theory as it presents itself in Southern epistemologies. I am a keen fan of his thought, his writings, his ideas, and today I don't doubt that it's going to be a robust session, and I'm looking forward to the discussions afterwards. I hope everybody's poised with various devices, pieces of paper, whatever it is, notes, so that we can jot down questions and afterwards have a really great discussion based on the paper today, which is titled Azania, Race and the Problem of South African Knowledges. Yes, without further ado, let me not stand in the way of what promises to be a fantastic session. Professor Modiri, over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pra, and thank you for the invitation to the Indexing Transformation Speaker Series. I've followed the speaker series with much interest, and much generative intellectual work has come out or has been presented at your space. So I'm very glad to also have received an invitation finally. I guess the only thing that I want to start by saying is that, of course, this is a work in progress, and you'll see that near the end it's going to get a little bit loose and a little bit embryonic and speculative, and that's because the project is in its making. I wanted to say a few things about critical race theory. As we know, critical race theory is facing a global onslaught, a global right-wing assault, particularly in the United States, but also here in South Africa, as well as in the UK and in parts of Europe. The idea, critical theories of race and critical Black perspectives on race and racial inequality and racial oppression are facing a new wave of backlash and a new wave of state repression. And it is in this spirit that I offer my own intervention into critical race studies or critical race theory. But as you'll see, what I want to elaborate upon in my research is really a shift or a turn in my research away from critical race theory in its strictly legal academic form to a more general, critical, and emancipatory discourse of race situated within the Black radical tradition, globally and locally. But what I'm calling a shift or a turn away from critical race theory might also really be understood as an expansion of the political and theoretical itinerary of Black critique, away from the internal or immanent focus on the ways in which law, legal ideology, and legal practices are imbricated in the politics and discourses of race, which is the traditional concern of critical race theory, to a broader or general interrogation of race as a fundamental pillar and primary logic in the very political foundations, the constituting or constitution of legal and social orders. The immediate political geography of my project, of course, is South Africa in its post-1994 temporality, what is commonly referred to as the new South Africa, but which I will suggest is better understood as South Africa 2.0, as a kind of software update or reconfiguration of the original new South Africa that was formulated by colonial intellectuals in the beginning of the 20th century. We need not, I think, rehash the empirical and existential details here. Suffice to say that despite the ostensible newness of post-1994 South Africa, the very old and the very sordid category of race remains a critical fault line across the material and symbolic worlds of the place we call South Africa. Indeed, if there is anything miraculous about the new South Africa, it might be the undeniable resilience of colonial apartheid power relations and mindsets. How firmly the economic, social, cultural, spatial, and psychological structures of white supremacy remained intact right through the grand project of the transition to Black political government. How did this happen? How did this continuity in the material and symbolic foundations of South Africa happen? The standard narrative within left liberal scholarship is, of course, by now familiar, right? So the left liberal account is that South Africa's political malaise is to be attributed, on the one hand, to an amorphous global modern imperial and capitalist order, Euro-American domination or imperialism, which places limits on what kind of change is possible. And on the other hand, South Africa's political malaise is tied to the lack of political will and the truly staggering maladministration and corruption of the new ANC government and Black elites. And Black elites as a category are often theorized in the social sciences in terms of a quite culturalist analysis about conspicuous consumption, and on the other hand, a political economy narrative of underdevelopment. As the story goes, the limits and failures that now confront South Africa have left us with a crisis of governance that is consistent with patterns across the formerly independent African continent, a crisis most dramatically marked by poverty, unemployment, and inequality affecting the majority Black population with powerful gendered subdivisions and dynamics. Okay, so that's the standard story, that the problem of South Africa is largely a socio-economic one, or rather a political economic one of maladministration, governance and corruption on the one hand, and of poverty, unemployment and inequality on the other hand, and that it's undeniable that it's the Black majority with all the gendered divisions there that bears the weight of this problem the most. I want to contest this interpretation, of course, by way of a different intellectual history and by way of a different analytic genealogy, which would locate the problems of the present South Africa in the formation of South Africa itself, right? In the idea that it's not that South Africa is going through problems, but that South Africa itself is the problem, right? And I want to suggest that it is the constitutive exclusion of Black people from human and political community that was central to the making of South Africa as a political idea and construct that ought to be the primary object of critique and justice. And I'm going to briefly expand upon this argument by threading together 3 moments of Black critique, or 3 episodes in my own study of this problem. First, I'm going to elaborate on the concept of Azania and the Azanian tradition, and Azania as a philosophical historical signifier, which offers us an entirely different theoretical paradigm for humanistic and social science study in South Africa. Then I'm going to trace or consider very briefly the role of what I've been calling South African disciplinary knowledges. In other words, I want to show that there is a tension between a South Africanist mode of analysis and an Azanian mode of analysis. And I'm going to suggest that so far, the South African knowledge production and institutions of public opinion have been thoroughly overdetermined by South African modes of analysis and not yet Azanian modes of analysis. And I'm going to be looking at three political logics that I think animate what we might call the political unconscious of South Africa, but also three political logics which I think animate and drive disciplinary knowledge in the humanities and social science. And if we have time, I'm going to relate the critique that I'm offering to the question of the constitution or constitutional abolition. You might have seen very curiously a number of articles coming out recently by a number of scholars whom I would call constitutional worshippers or constitutional defenders. Very strange, sort of very similar lines of argument about how the constitution is not all that bad and so forth. I'm going to try and offer some thinking and some response to that argument as well. So the first part of what I want to do is to discuss the tension between, or is to give a history of Azanian thought in relation to the making of South Africa, and to start drawing out what I'm calling the tension between South Africanist and Azanian modes of analysis, which I take to be fundamentally irreconcilable and incommensurate modes of analysis. Let me make it plain that I'm recalling the Azanian political and intellectual tradition in order to restage its fundamental opposition to the political imaginary and vision of the Charterist or Congress tradition of the ruling African National Congress and its allied political formations and intellectual traditions. Of course, we know that the Congress tradition ultimately shaped and determined the making of the post-1994 legal, political, and social order. But the true challenge of the long Azanian tradition is not its critique of the negotiated settlement and of post-1994 constitutional democracy, but rather the Azanian tradition contests the very idea of South Africa, in inverted commas. Azania was, after all, developed precisely as the political, cultural, and ethical antithesis to the racist and racial polity of South Africa, as constituted by the powers of settler colonial white supremacy. The provenance of the term Azania is a long and protean one, but for our purposes, Azania served as a political and philosophical signifier introduced by the Pan-Africanist Congress and then adopted also by the Black consciousness movement in the middle of the 20th century in South Africa as the true and liberated name for the territory that is currently mapped as South Africa. Azania, therefore, is a key term in the lexicon of the Africanist Black radical political and intellectual tradition because it reflects the view of South Africa as an artifact of colonial sovereignty that came into being in 1910 formally through the racial contract between the two European conquering powers that had subjugated the indigenous African population and other oppressed groups and racialized them in different ways, but ultimately as Blacks, in the process of inventing the political category of whiteness. Azania marks the repudiation of the settler colonial foundations of South Africa, and it beckons what we might call a post-conquest, not simply post-apartheid society. In historical terms, then, Azania is a placeholder for a long-standing emancipatory and abolitionist horizon first articulated by Africans through the waging of wars of resistance against colonial rule. It is perhaps because of its marking out of South Africa as the fundamental problem for human liberation and justice that the Azanian tradition has been the object of much historical silencing, distortion, and repression. In the academy, among the discontinuous mix of political rationalities and conceits that have led to the eclipsing of the Azanian tradition, and with it any articulations of Black radical thought in South Africa, I would speculatively identify some of the following rationalities that have played a role in silencing Black radical thought. One, the ubiquitous valorization of Western values, institutions, and knowledges. Taken for granted assumptions about the solidity, naturalness, and permanence of the South African state, what I'm calling South Africanism, or what has been called South Africanism. A hegemonic ANC-centered narrative or a Congress-centered narrative of history and politics. A widespread and uncritical acceptance of liberal multiculturalism, multiracialism, and moderate politics as entrenched in the post-1994 constitutional order. Add to these the Eurocentric and ahistorical dismissals of African and Black internationalisms as narrow, as nativist, essentialist, reverse racist, chauvinistic, victimological, atavistic, or in any case, unpragmatic. We see that there has been powerful currents of anti-Africanist anti-decolonization, and anti-Black thought and practice that has congealed over the past few decades in the systematic writing out of the narratives, actors, and ideas that make up what we've been calling the Azanian tradition. And you will note that very soon a special issue of the journal Theoria will be coming out with a fuller elaboration of what an Azanian critical philosophy might look like. Yet the Azanian tradition endures in Black political and cultural memory, and we know that it has now returned more forcefully in public and academic discourse to register the reminder that the question of how to define the nation and constitute a political community in the wake of colonial apartheid remains an unsettled question. The critical view that freedom and justice in South Africa remain incomplete or outstanding or unresolved problems, or rather the idea that post-1994 legal and political rearrangements have continued to reproduce and leave unredressed the historical results of settler colonialism, white supremacy, and racial capitalism. This is a key premise of the Azanian critique of the present, that the national question, as it was called, is still an open question, and that whatever rearrangements took place post-1994 have not fundamentally addressed settler colonialism, white supremacy, and racial capitalism. This critique, of course, implicates jurisprudence and more specifically the 1996 Constitution, to the extent that this Constitution secures the South African polity and preserves the racist foundations on which it was built under the guise of liberal democracy and through the ideological mystifications of transformation and reconciliation, two terms which both involve the pragmatic accommodation of white interests and entitlements. Prophetically, it is significant that this failure to dismantle relations of conquest was anticipated by Azanian intellectuals in their critique of the political ideology of the Congress tradition. Okay. So one of the things I'm suggesting here is that the Azanian tradition is now in its prophetic epoch, since its concerns about how the Congress tradition was thinking about the question of the nation and the question of freedom is now playing itself out in South Africa's political, cultural, and other contradictions. The Azanian political tradition is distinguished from many of the other anti-colonial and anti-apartheid movements by its uncompromising, decolonizing, and abolitionist orientation towards the South African colonial state form. The primary thesis and binding motif of Azanian thought is that South Africa itself is an unjust and unethical political formation, that it is axiomatically racist as a polity because of its predication upon conquest, slavery, and racial subjugation. The basic problem and fundamental injustice of South Africa in Azanian thought is not identified in its laws and practices and excesses, discrimination, segregation, violence, but rather in its very founding, as a European-created and European-dominated racial polity, a white dominion or a white man's country. As a political construct, South Africa was created without and against the conquered peoples within its political territory. The native in this historical order was a mere subject of conquest, under the state, but of course not a party to it. The 1910 Union of South Africa was, of course, the ultimate consolidation of European domination insofar as it signaled the final death knell for indigenous kingdoms and sovereignties, and it marked the loss by Africans of land, of labor power, of mineral wealth, of cattle, of self-knowledge, and of sovereignty. In this sense, the making of South Africa through the unification of its two European conquering powers constitutes a racial contract. That is a moral, political, economic, and epistemological covenant to found a polity on the basis of the principle and system of white supremacy. And later, if we have time at the end, I'm going to talk specifically about the founding father of human rights, Jan Smuts, and situate some of the kind of formulation of the racial contract in his political, philosophical career. The formation of South Africa as a settler colony was built on a form of colonial governmentality which asserted the supremacy of Western civilization, the necessity of white domination, and the necessity of Black subordination, even the inevitability of Black subordination, as well as the need for native peoples to be destabilized, controlled, and governed. The political rationale of the formation of South Africa was, of course, to preserve white settlement and to avert insurrection and rebellion. We know about the Bulhoek massacre as an example of this. And the economic rationale of the making of South Africa was mass proletarianization and exploitation of Black labor. To be sure, both a political economy, what we might call racial capitalism, and a political ontology, anti-Blackness, are integral to the normative and structural violence of South Africa's settler colonial foundation. In particular, as we know, the disproportionate numerical superiority of the colonized African population and the resultant belief by the colonists that European domination had to be permanent. In other words, the colonialist intellectuals who formulated the idea of South Africa understood that white people could only exist in South Africa as South Africans if they were in a dominant position. That, in other words, white supremacy had to be permanent and therefore necessitated the practice of ultra-colonialism, which was characterized by an extreme mode of racial hierarchy and subjugation, in which indigenous alterity was to be neutralized and contained. And here, the kind of signs of cruelty were written all over the colonial project. The historical record this bears out that in order to institutionalize and maintain European supremacy and white settlement in South Africa, Africans and other political communities were subjected to perpetual and systematic inferiorization at the level of their political status and human capacities. The negation of the humanity of colonized and racialized peoples was accompanied and reinforced by the entrenchment of colonial rule based on the political, legal, cultural, and economic systems, practices, and ideas of white supremacy. Right? So here the assertion was that the necessity of white supremacy in South Africa was tied to the continuity of a Western episteme to govern political and social life. Now, in part 2, I'm going to talk about the political logics that I take to be underpinning this process of constitution, right? This process of setting out the constitutional foundations of South Africa. And I'm going to show that South Africa 2.0 of 1994 was constituted by the same logics and through the same logics. But to return to this point that I need to make here, the injury and injustice of colonization, we must remember, did not only take place at the socio-economic and political levels, but more profoundly also at the epistemic, metaphysical, and spiritual levels, which is something that reveals the limits of a political economy, social history, or Marxian analysis. This was not primarily a will to only exclude, deprive, and discriminate against colonized people. Rather, the aim of the colonial experiment in South Africa, and incompletely realized, of course, was to colonize the very being and consciousness of Africans by destroying their metaphysical and material relations to land, culture, spirit, and most importantly, to each other by way of ethnic divisions. Once that destabilization has taken place, the next step is to violently incorporate the Africans into an alien life world to create this perpetual disorientation at the psychic and spiritual levels as well. So as the Comarovs would put it, there was both a colonial state and a state of colonization that was imposed on African peoples and other racialized communities in the making of South Africa. This in turn came to produce a psycho-political dynamic, a master-slave relation, primarily along the lines of race, that still structures the basic features of South African social relations and subject positions. Put in other words, colonial conquest and its unfoldment in the 20th century making of South Africa was a subject-producing process that invented and entrenched particular political identities, native settler, black and white, and then organized and institutionalized these identities in a relentlessly bifurcated, hierarchical, and antagonistic relationship to one another through the mechanisms of political, legal, economic, and cultural power, including the cultural power of knowledge production. Now, I want to spend some time pointing out that under the circumstances of this colonial construction of South Africa, the emergence of the ideology of Africanism and the shift to a more political register within the African National Congress, as well as the new conditions and possibilities of the 1940s, marked a major displacement, right, of an earlier tradition of African resistance that really forms in tandem with the formation of South Africa as a kind of assimilationist tradition or a vindicationist tradition, which associated progress for Africans with the fulfillment of the promises of trusteeship and imperial citizenship. The Azanian tradition, in my view, does not begin with the formation of the ANC, but it begins with the first fundamental political upheaval within the ANC itself that emerges with the rise of the Youth League of the 1940s, of course, under the leadership of Anton Lembede. As I say, the ideology of Africanism that Lembede formulates marked a major displacement of the conservative and accommodationist tradition in African politics that the ANC was founded upon. In this period, the politics of assimilation, cooperation with white power, gradual change, and moral suasion not only became obsolete, but was viewed by the Azanian tradition or the Africanists as ethically and politically untenable. Right? This was because in the Africanist political and historical analysis, white people had no right in moral, political, or juridical terms, or entitlement to rule over the South African land, peoples, and political territory of the place which they had themselves christened as South Africa. Such a right, if it could be called that, belonged only to the African by reason of both indigeneity and numerical majority status. So both historical and democratic reasons played a role here. Working within a Black Marxist analytic, Bernard Mugubani has also added that South Africa would come to belong to Africans also through what he calls the life and death labors extracted from them to build everything the settlers claim as their own. It followed in the Azanian analysis from this position that Africans were not merely a nation among nations as the sort of logic of charterism suggests within the borders of South Africa, but they were the nation and were, in the language of the 1948 ANC Youth League Basic Policy, the rightful owners of the land. In the Africanist view, therefore, South Africa as a political entity was illegitimate and void, both because it was predicated on dispossession and subjugation and because of its undemocratic and exclusionary foundations. The Africanists, as we know, adhered to a position of non-cooperation, non-compliance, and non-collaboration with the institutions of the colonial state, such as the representative councils and the native administrative boards, as well as with elite organizations and bodies, except for some moments of strategic necessity, at least on their account. Instead, they advocated for boycotts, they turned to mass organization and mobilization, and they embarked upon programs of radical political education towards self-determination, social and psychological emancipation, and national liberation, which, especially in the Africanist itinerary, would give rise to a broader internationalist struggle. This reflects a clear repudiation of the legitimacy of the colonial state and a formulation of anti-colonialism centered on a struggle to reclaim the land and to reclaim political and territorial sovereignty, as well as to recover and reassert African being and culture in its historical circumstance, not in its pristine ancient form, but in its historical circumstance. So as you can see, the Azanian political project stands and continues to stand in significant contrast to the historical striving of the Congress tradition for civil and political rights, for belonging, inclusion, and recognition within the settler-created and dominated social order, right? Since the Congress tradition sought access to the civilizational accoutrement and the universalist promises of Western modernity, right? Ultimately, the Congress tradition sought to or understood liberation as the racial democratization of the colonial system. For the Africanists, such a striving could only lead to a dead end. Now, let me just say that the political or emancipatory program of the Azanian tradition had three crucial elements which indeed constitute a revolutionary transformation or constitute a revolution. First, they argued that a liberated South Africa, or rather they have three conditions for a liberated South Africa, which would be an abolished South Africa, which would be Azania. One, it would entail the remaking of African identities against tribalist and ethnic and racial divisions, as well as the spiritual and cultural repair and transformation of those identities. Secondly, it would entail the total dismantling of white supremacy and not its accommodation. And three, it would involve a basic change in the fundamental structure and governing values of South African society through a reordering of its political, economic, and cultural intellectual systems and practices. So that's why this concept for me of abolition is much stronger here and much more relevant, because from the earliest articulations of Africanism or Azanian political thought, abolition, not egalitarian reform of South Africa, was the historical mission and the ethical political demand of the Black radical tradition. There was this abolitionist striving to terminate the constitutional and constitutive foundations of South Africa that the Africanists asserted flowed from both the ethical and political conviction of the Azanian tradition, but also flowed from their analytic hypothesis that South Africa as an embodiment of settler colonial white supremacy was such that it could not be reformed. Right. So one of the things I'm trying to map here, we're familiar with the discourses of abolition historically around slavery in particular, and we're familiar with the newer discourse, well, not that new, but the radicalized discourses of abolition around prison abolition. And I'm arguing here that the Azanian tradition was articulating a much stronger concept of abolition, which was a concept of constitutional abolition, which directs itself to the constitutional and political foundations of a racial order. I just want to indicate that the Azanian tradition, of course, is understood to make much of race, right? They're often called racial nationalists, especially in South Africa. But let me just explain what the Azanians or Azanian intellectuals understood by race. Race for the Azanians was understood to originate from the Western racialization of the world through European colonial invasion, conquest, and rule, which by many accounts was set in motion by what Sylvia Wynter describes as the 1492 event, which unfolded on these shores from the 1652 arrival of the Dutch colonizers up to the 19th and 20th century British imperial and later general white supremacist rule. It's also important to note that practitioners such as Cedric Robinson traced the problem of race within the intra-European contentions long before the New World voyages. Nonetheless, in this process, groups of human populations who knew themselves by other names and signs came to be marked by this thing called race, what Amesa Zé calls the sordid sign of race, categorized and divided through metaphors of skin color and reason, generated from within European philosophical, socio-cultural, scientific, symbolic, and cognitive systems of representation. Thus, it was most decisively in the colonial encounter that whiteness and blackness came into being as historical, symbolic, and material forms. It was through conquest and racial subjugation that the historical categories and social positions of black and white were produced and reproduced. Right? So you see, there's no racial essentialism here. There's a complete understanding of the historical political construction of the idea of race. On this view, whiteness marks a position of historical dominance buoyed by fictions of ontological and epistemological superiority established and produced through colonization. Blackness, on the other hand, represents both the negated antithesis of whiteness as well as the collective and ongoing resistance to it. So what I'm trying to point out here is that the way the Africanists are using race is not, as most people say, in this kind of essentialist, static way. They're talking about political, historical processes of blackening and whitening the world. This is to say that in the understanding of the Black radical tradition, race represents an ethical and political historical category, a marker of social and symbolic positioning originating from the power relationships and ideological systems established and produced through European domination, colonization, and white supremacy. In Azanian thought specifically, this power relationship was generally expressed in the Manichaean divide between conqueror and conquered, invader and invaded, dispossessor and dispossessed, settler and native, black and white. Right? We know these divisions. So rather than a pre-given and fixed fact about the human species rooted in pigmentation or biology or genetics or geography or even civilization, as the colonialist discourse variously posits, race is precisely a social and political relation of antagonism constructed through history through the ontological and epistemological mystifications of European colonizers. So the Africanists refer to what they call the race myth, which for them fuses a false logic of biological and cultural difference with a vertically defined configuration of humanity that results in what Magubane called a complete rupture in the human family, as it was divided into inferior and superior races, something that Biko would say results in a lack of mutuality. In the making of the colonial state of South Africa, race was, without a doubt, in many ways, the first principle of social organization and subject formation. And it's very interesting that race was a double principle, right? Race was in reference to the two white races themselves. So when people talked about non-racialism in the beginning, it was between the two white races, as they're called, and then, of course, between the white nation and the native population. Of course, race, the articulation of race as a principle of social organization and subject formation in the colonial period was always already articulated through norms of gender, sexuality, religion, ethnicity, and class. The white minority state that emerged from the 1910 Union of South Africa was predicated on the belief in the natural and necessary superiority of white people, and it was constituted through the assembling of political, legal, cultural, educational, spatial, and social systems that were based on this belief. So racism acquires an objective material basis in the process of land dispossession, slavery, racial proletarianization, labor exploitation, political and legal exclusion, the impairment of the cultural and educational capabilities, and the routinized cruelty and contempt suffered differentially by racially oppressed political communities degraded as non-white in the colonial imagination. In their interventions on what is famously termed the native question, the Africanists critiqued the multiracial liberalism that animated the Congress movement, and which was ultimately encapsulated in the Freedom Charter, which was later taken up as a central motif of the United Democratic Front in the 1980s, including the United Democratic Front's wars against the Azanian tradition of that period, as well as this multiracial liberalism was then also taken up in the rainbowist constitutional dispensation of the 1990s. In the first place, for Sobukwe, the problem of multiracialism is that it implies that there are such basic insuperable differences between the various national groups because it compartmentalizes those national groups into reified and impermeable racial identities and interests. For Sobukwe, of course, this was racialism multiplied, and it would result in what he called a kind of democratic apartheid. Sobukwe is saying in the 1960s, but look at how prophetic he's talking about, that this idea of thinking about the national question would ultimately give rise to a democratic apartheid. In the second place, multiracialism, to use Sobukwe's words, panders to white interests. It fosters and safeguards them. The roots of multiracialism, as embodied in the Freedom Charter's famous declaration that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white, lies in how it ultimately preserved the unequal relations of conquest by erasing the historical conditions of white power and presence and by bypassing the settler colonial South Africa. In this context, the fact that the Freedom Charter was in fact also predominantly conceptualized by non-Africans and especially white leftists surely added insult to injury in the Africanist concern. This failure to resolve the historical antagonism was seen by the Africanists as a device for perpetuating another important term by Peter Raborogo, slavery under a new guise, and for promulgating a concept of nationhood in which dispossessed and their dispossessors, victims and their robbers are all countrymen. So here's the heart of the matter. Rather than dislodge the material and symbolic basis of the myth of race as the Africanists would have it, multiracialism, which is falsely called non-racialism in today's parlance, it seeks to manage and reify race. Doesn't seek to abolish race as the Africanists want to do. It seeks to manage race through accommodationist and egalitarian adjustments that nonetheless maintain the underlying political ontology and economy that produced the categories and realities of race in the first place. Now, I hope I've now set out some of the kind of the irreconcilable tensions or contentions between Azanian thinking and South Africanist thinking. We know that it was the vision and the telos of the Congress tradition that gained international prominence in the anti-apartheid years, and that ultimately determined the path of the transition to the second new South Africa. And on this argument, you'll see that for the Africanist tradition, the negotiated settlement was a natural entailment of the Congress tradition's vision. So if one sees the telos of the Congress tradition, which formed the constitutional project, as ultimately being about accommodation, integration, and assimilation, then in very important respects, the liberation project of the ANC has largely been achieved, except for its later failures. But it has, in theory, arrived at its telos, which was integration. Indeed, the dominant conceptions of history, law, justice, political community, and nationhood, of social and economic organization that inframe South Africa's post-1994 constitutional democracy derives their most essential elements from the mythology of the Congress tradition as it unfolded throughout the 20th century. From its emergence in the 1940s within the ANC and its ultimate break from the ANC in the late 1950s, the Azanian perspective shows us that the second new South Africa derives its heritage from political and legal actors who generally acceded to their colonial status, who accepted the terms of the colonialist discourse, especially its concept of race and civilization, and historically adopted a moderate and reformist orientation to anti-colonial and anti-apartheid struggle. And the orientation of the Congress tradition was an orientation heavily influenced by white fears and anxieties. By the end of the 1950s, the cunning and tragedy of settler colonial reason had crystallized in the realization by the Africanists that the perfection of colonial conquest, was to be generated from within the Congress tradition and its principal document, the Freedom Charter. In the Azanian perspective, the Charterist program of liberation amounted to an egalitarian adjustment, that is, a transformation, and at the same time preservation of the racialized socio-political and cultural order that was entrenched through colonial dispossession. The Freedom Charter's main pillar and leading declaration, that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, performs a crucial historical erasure and obfuscation of the fact of dispossession of indigenous land and labor and colonial settlement. So in this way, the Freedom Charter reflects what has been called the amnesiac character of settler colonialism in its persistent drive to supersede the conditions of its operation, to make itself appear invisible, natural, without origin, without end, and inevitable. The Africanist critique of the Charter as antithetical to freedom and independence lives on due to the fact that the famous declaration of the Freedom Charter was then also included in the preamble of the 1996 Constitution, thereby extending the right of conquest. What is important for the argument at this stage is to underscore that the Azanian view was that the Congress tradition's answer to the national question, its overall political philosophy and its strategy of anti-colonial and anti-apartheid struggle leading into the new South Africa was both ethically untenable and politically unjust, but also most importantly, practically unsustainable in the long term. And I want to just make the point that the Congress tradition is not only the ANC, but it's also the dominant white intellectual traditions, liberal and Marxist, actually, the concatenation of liberal and Marxist orthodoxies, which were part of the ANC's formulation of its theoretical and philosophical program. In the context of jurisprudence in the afterlife of colonial apartheid, the challenge posed by the Africanist and Black radical traditions has been translated into what can be called a decolonization critique or an abolitionist critique of the present 1996 Constitution. This critique itself is a response to the continuity and persistence of racially determined social divisions and power relations, which bring into question the political temporality that designates the present South Africa as post-apartheid. The critique of the Constitution, or the radical critique of the Constitution, or constitutional abolitionism, is also a response to the prevailing discourse of constitutional optimism or what lawyers will know as transformative constitutionalism, and its monumentalizing celebration of the democratic transition. Scholars associated with this abolitionist critique have drawn on the Azanian tradition and African philosophy to issue 3 challenges regarding the 1996 constitution, or the post-1994 constitutional order. The first argument of the abolitionists is that the post-1994 constitution is an evolutionary, legal, political, and epistemic rearrangement of white South Africa, or the conqueror South Africa. It's an adjustment or a makeover, not a fundamental rupture. 2, the argument is that the post-1994 constitutional democracy sustains the colonial logics of state formation, of political economy and racialization, and that it also upholds the erasure of African cosmologies, legalities, and epistemologies. Thirdly, the problem of the new constitutional dispensation, according to its abolitionist and decolonization critics, is that it naturalizes and normalizes the settler-created world, the conqueror South Africa, as the only possible world. This is not a critique about the question of whether the constitution contains the potential to ameliorate social injustices, since this question would involve an investment in the constitution. Rather, this is a critique that measures the value and progress of the constitution in terms of a much more expansive account of historical injustice and a much wider vision of liberation. Constitutional abolitionism, which is a critique not of the constitutional text per se, but of the constitutional foundations of South Africa as preserved in the present legal text. Constitutional abolitionism interrogates the present constitution in terms of its impact on the social and political foundations of society. In other words, has the new South Africa altered the political foundations of South Africa, or has it continued them? And might that be an answer to the ongoing malaise or the ongoing crisis of constitutional democracy? So we're not looking here at the level of the circumstances of individuals or groups like social movements and court litigants, but we're asking, have the historical structures of white South Africa been abolished? And of course, I'm going to suggest that the answer is in the negative. The key contention here, before I close with some closing remarks, is that rather than accommodate old orders of power and old subject positions, the Azanian tradition envisaged that the liberation struggle must produce not only a new polity, new social relations of belonging, and a new economic system and cultural values, but also that it must in the process forge a new historical subject. When neither a radically new polity nor a new historical subject emerges in the process of the transition, a deep inertia sets in, akin to an untreated or poorly treated wound becoming septic. As the historical record attests, the adoption of the 1996 constitution ultimately consolidated the defeat of the Azanian tradition and of the anti-colonial and black radical intellectual and political frameworks in the academy. This fact gives the re-emerging Africanist and black consciousness-based scholarship that's emerging in South Africa, it gives it what I would call a prophetic and haunting quality. So one of the arguments that I want to end with here, one of the provocations I want to end with is to argue that it's not simply that the South African post-1994 order features a continuity at the level of sort of the material and symbolic structures of South African society. It does feature continuity at that level, and that level of continuity is itself enough to argue for a more abolitionist politics. But I want to actually argue that South Africa, the first South Africa and the new South Africa, or rather what I want to argue is that the political logics that were deployed by colonial intellectuals in the making of the first new South Africa casts more than just a shadow over the second new South Africa. And the key character in the story I'm going to try and tell is Jan Smuts. Because I think there are 3 political logics that ultimately suffused the reconciliation. And it's also very interesting, as you know, that the making of the first new South Africa, the Jan Smuts Botha project, was a project under the heading of conciliation, right? And that post-1994, it was a project of reconciliation, right? So there's a very powerful, that's why I say more than just a shadow, way in which the political logics of South Africanism, of the native question, and of the right of conquest were remade or redeployed or reinvented in the making of the new South Africa. And it is that question of continuity that I want to think about. A lot of what animates my research is the question of how this absurd situation that we have, right, of white minority political domination in a Black African country, how it can persist, in the different guises that it has persisted over time. And I want to suggest that it has to do with the project of Jan Smuts of making South Africa a white man's country. A project that I want to suggest is still in historical motion. Now, we know that this project, which I've described, of this idea that South Africa is a product or a culmination of the early 20th century white settler nationalist politics, right? That the pursuit of the ideological construction of white national unity and solidarity in the making of the new South Africa is, of course, what other thinkers like Saul Dubois call South Africanism, right? And South Africanism as an idea begins very early, following the crisis set in motion by the Anglo-Boer War between the conqueror groups in South Africa. It begins in 1903 and theorized by a number of people. It is recorded to start between the Afrikaner J.H. Hofmeyer and the British colonial secretary Joseph Chamberlain, and their agreement that the English and the Boers or the English and the Afrikaners are not really separated either in interest or in character, that they are in fact kinsfolk. So the main architect of the discourse of South Africanism is, of course, Lord Milner, who promoted this new white identity under the sign of what he calls a broad South Africanism. And it's very interesting that a lot of constitutional defenders also are talking about the need for a new or a shared South African identity, a broad South African identity, very much following the epistemological and ideological footsteps of the colonial intellectuals. So this whole idea of a broad South Africanism was centered on the imperative of white unity, which was of course necessary for South Africa to negotiate its place within the British Empire, and was built very much on the romance of conquest, right? On this idea that this place belongs to us. The most definitive moment for the making of South Africanism was, of course, the colonial generals Botha and Smuts, who in their political party sought to pursue white unity and South African national. The aim was to eradicate the bitterness and the corruption that had, or to eradicate the bitterness that had defined the relations between the English and the Afrikaners before that. So, one of the Congress Party documents already in around 1906 talks about what Jan Smuts and General Botha are interested in doing. They want to unite all white inhabitants of the state into one great South African nation. So, in some senses, when people say white South African, that's that's a tautology. Whites are the first and original and only South Africans from the Azanian perspective. And of course, we know that Botha and Smuts, in this iteration of the South African Party after the Het Volk Party, laid the foundations for what we would later come to call apartheid. So 20th century white politics of the kind that animated Smuts was of course animated by something that we call the Black Peril, or the native question, where the status of the native was secondary to the consolidation of white unity. So as Lewis Gordon puts it, in this view, white people were the other of each other, and black people were below even the other, as Lewis Gordon would put it, right? So the assertion of white settler power was running alongside the second logic that I want to talk about in relation to the new South Africa, which is the logic of the native problem, right? Where the native in the colonial imagination is situated or posited as the absolute alterity of the European ego. right? We know that colonial intellectuals, traditions, and policy making at the turn of the 20th century was heavily preoccupied with native policy, native question, or what Jan Smuts called our immense native problem. And Jan Smuts, in a speech called The White Man's Task, I mean, makes it clear here that the political status of the native is a secondary question to the supremacy of Western civilization and the prosperity of the white South African nation in South Africa. He explains indeed that the reason that the native question or the native problem in South Africa is different to the US Negro reality is, of course, because of population dynamics. The fact that here the white population faces what he called an overwhelming black population with a small white population, right? So the kind of science of conquest here is concerned with how do we normalize this obviously abnormal situation. Jan Smuts says that the reason that this is also a question is because he's concerned that natives have the simplest minds. They understand only the simplest ideas or ideals, and they are almost animal-like in the simplicity of their minds and ways. This is one of the reasons he's suggesting that there's a fundamental incompatibility between the political status of native and white people. He calls this situation then our immense native problem. How do we deal with these sub-rational beings who are both native and majority? So the powerful move here of Jan Smuts' South Africanist project is to turn South Africa into a white country with a black problem. That is why if you look at the disciplines, the social sciences, the people being studied generally are black people. If you look at youth development programs of the state, it's black people. If you look at the public social service interventions, it's black people who are the object. It's black people who are the problem. If you read the Constitution, when it says the 1993 Constitution says there is a need not for vengeance, but for Ubuntu, of course, once again, it installs the logic of the native problem, right? So the many scholars have pointed out that the native question or the native problem is a shared political rationality of the white settler community, that the differences between the British and the Afrikaners, and I'm going to argue also that the differences between, 5 more minutes, okay, that the differences between the conservative, liberal, and Marxist analytics in the academy were not differences about colonialism, but they were differences within the colonial predicament. They were not outside of it, since all white people had an interest in normalizing settlement. So the native problem as a predicament has two questions to it. How does a minority legitimate its rule over a majority? And how do settlers naturalize their right to native land? Since, as one of my colleagues, Dumiso Dladla, points out, white people did not arrive with any land on their ships. The question of the native problem is how do we normalize or naturalize white social, political, economic, and cultural power and presence in South Africa? How to be and exist as white in South Africa? That is the native problem. And this problem, I want to argue, is lodged in the psyche of all white people. It's the political unconscious of South Africa. And it also reoriented academic disciplines around questions of managing the native, of colonial governmentality, questions of order, questions of rule, but also questions of how to achieve ideological coercion and consensus that would not jeopardize the fundamental principles of white supremacy. And there are two principles of white supremacy that was being pursued by the Smuts Botha project. And the first is that the prosperity of white people must be preserved. And that the centrality of Western civilization and Western culture must be made. That's really at the bare bone level what South Africanism was about: to maintain white prosperity and dominance, and to maintain Western civilization as the ordering paradigm of life in South Africa. How that would take shape, of course, came to change. The Azanian tradition saw the native question as an illegitimate question, a question that didn't deserve an answer. For them, the problem was a settler problem, and the question was how to recreate and liberate Azania. The Congress tradition's fatal error here was to try to give a progressive answer to the native question, and that answer would ultimately become human rights and accommodation. And of course, what makes this ironic is, of course, that one of the so-called founding fathers of human rights in the 20th century is, of course, Jan Smuts himself. I want to make the argument, or I want to speculate, and of course, you know that the Union buildings is, of course, the kind of the two towers that signify the partnership and the reconciliation of the two white conqueror races. And South Africa, in the second New South Africa, of course, was also consolidated at those Union buildings, where Nelson Mandela, of course, read a poem by a white Afrikaans woman to signify the second reconciliation. And of course, we've also maintained the capital cities that came out of the colonial contentions, right? Cape Town, Pretoria, and Bloemfontein, which is a very bizarre mix. So the argument that I want to make is that the first and the new South Africas share a much deeper historical resonance and connection than we might think about. And that understanding the resonance between the first and the new South Africa is the key to understanding our present reality. It seemed to me that what the Freedom Charter and ultimately the Constitution did was to adjust the racial contract. It was to racially democratize the Smuts-Botha project of constructing South Africa as a polity based on white prosperity and Western imperialism. And Jan Smuts talks, for example, about how in other words, the reason I'm trying to suggest that we shouldn't focus on the specific forms in which the white supremacy takes place, but on the continuity of white supremacy, is because Jan Smuts also in that speech talks about South Africa as a kind of laboratory where a white experiment of making a white man's land in Southern Africa. Remember, this was a project he also shared with Cecil John Rhodes. And he also traces this white experiment to 1652. So even Jan Smuts understands that the question of conquest was to now be consolidated in the making of South Africa and was now progress along these lines. In this regard, it seems to me that if the South African Constitution of 1996 and the negotiated settlement and the ANC's project was ultimately to preserve South Africa, then I have a little bit of a question for all of us to think about. Isn't then it correct to also recognize Jan Smuts, among others, as the grandfather and father of the new South Africa? And is it not on this reading right about, has the time not come for us to restore Jan Smuts to his rightful place as one of the founding fathers of the ANC? Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Professor Modiri, for your presentation today. I'm certain that it has been provocative and has generated some questions. So let us, without further ado, jump straight into the questions. If there's anybody who has any questions, please, you may take the floor by way of either raising your hands with that yellow icon, or you could, I think that's possibly the best way. And I will keep register of who's raising hands here. Or perhaps Matthew, if you can see in the chat section there, can you just let us know who's got a hand raised?
I will do.
Perhaps I can then start us off with a question if there aren't any hands coming forward here. I mean, I think that your ending is the question you have about reinstituting Jan Smuts as a founding figure based on the historicity of I guess white supremacist and South African, the conceptualizing of South Africa as a nation state, which of course is very much rooted, as you have shared for this past hour, very much rooted in white supremacist, white settler colonialism ideology. So I guess my question is tacking onto that. And it acknowledges that these presences of whiteness, of white cultures, of power, the historicity of white supremacist rule, has resulted in almost an arrogance, which is typified by complacency amongst sort of white liberal scholarship, white liberals. And it is protected, certainly, as you have also shared, it's protected by the rhetoric of the Congress's assimilation and negotiation of the turnover of South Africa. So essentially, it's a rooting down of these white cultures that still persist. And in fact, some sort of bamboozlement that was happening, that it was this idea that we were emerging in a very revolutionary way out of deep supremacist violence, but actually that's not the case, as you've so well articulated here. And so these substantive colonial headlines that keep perpetuating themselves, it's almost as if there's a stagnated yearning for radicality, something that's a little bit more purposive, which I think is part of the rationale of this constitutional abolitionism. So I'm interested actually in I think you mentioned from the work that you've done previously on this philopraxis of constitutional abolitionism. And I suppose part of my thinking is that very typical to the sort of white liberal tradition, it would be almost a lazy liberal tradition, is to frame up this revolution as a threat to white peril. So somebody might bring up, oh, does this mean that we're heading to Zimbabwe, a situation like Zimbabwe? Zimbabwe is always the case in point for white liberals to say, like, we don't want to go there. And so I guess my question is more, what are your thoughts around that kind of a reaction? Of course, it's steeped in its own frustrations. Does it mean some sort of rewriting of the Constitution? Because, of course, that is also the bastion of white liberal thought. It's the card that constantly gets whipped out. But we have one of the most forward-thinking constitutions. So what would your remark be to that kind of a reaction, that one takes it to, well, Zimbabwe happened? Is that what you're asking for when you talk about constitutional abolitionism? Are you wanting Zimbabwe to happen to South Africa?
Thank you. Yes, I mean, that's why I'm increasingly interested in thinking about the native problem, not only as a kind of policy event in early 20th century, but actually a political rationality and political unconscious that actually would ultimately come to infect even the liberal anti-colonialists, if you want to call them that. Because one of the things that happened, one of the things that that Smuts, Botha, and the other colonial intellectuals who are thinking about the native question are very good at doing is to posit this idea that, to the extent that Black people are incapable of self-government and reason, that they are sub-rational beings, remember that they have simple minds, that they pose a danger not only to white people, but also to themselves. And that, so that Black rage, Black political rage, Black political agitation, Black political protest becomes itself a problem that needs to be managed. It becomes itself a problem that needs to be controlled. And there are markers throughout history in which one of the powerful mechanisms of that control, of course, is cultural, educational control, and also the kind of social scientific knowledges that are being produced. And one of the, I think, powerful ways of entrenching the native problem is through the displacement of race in favor of class as the primary term of analysis, because by doing that, you deprive, as it were, the analytic imagination around South Africa of an understanding of the terms of the antagonism. So one of the things that settler colonial intellectuals have constantly been interested in is, how do we dissolve the antagonism? How do we make it disappear as a historical fact? How do we remove conquest and settler colonialism from the universe of juristic facts? Part of that process of erasure requires that we be vigilant of any emerging black extremist, black radical. Everywhere you go, in the US, in South Africa, same thing. There's this concern of black extremism or black radicalism, precisely because it redraws the antagonism much more clearly. And so it was an important success of the colonial intellectuals to install the native problem in the white mind, and of course to also install it in the civilized African mind, to say, if you're going to be assimilated into this cultural order, then be aware of the problematic natives in your midst. So the argument I'm suggesting is that at some point in its history, the ANC, the Congress tradition rather, inherits the duty to manage the native as a problem, and inherits the duty to manage black political rage. So the question leading up to the New South Africa was exactly this question: how to make sure that black political rage does not institutionalize itself in the form of what the black consciousness movement or the Pan-Africanists envisaged as a different kind of polity. And I'm not making any assessments about the real politique of them, whether they would work or whether they would solve all our problems. But I'm saying that there was a clear understanding that the native problem had to be installed in the disciplines, had to be installed in political and legal governmentality to ensure that, you know, black radical political discourses do not emerge and poison black minds. And if you look at commentary, I mean, if you look at the commentary on black radicalism or black politics in South Africa, especially the type written by whites, it tends to be this idea of a creeping, emerging, arising threat or fear. You know, talk about the rise of racial nationalism or the rise of it. So there's this constant idea that it's coming back and we need to stop it or we need to control it. And in fact, we might find it interesting that one of the recognized intellectuals of the ANC, Thabo Mbeki, has recently come out quite strongly around the question of land expropriation and compensation, redrawing exactly this Congress Azanian or Congress Africanist distinction by saying that this stuff about taking land back from white people is an Africanist thing. We've already decided that the settler colonial problem is no longer a problem. What we're going to deal with is bread and butter issues of black people. So I'm interested very much in what ways was the native problem the animating principle of the making of the second New South Africa. And part of that is related to something else, which is that line in the interim constitution that says there's a need not for vengeance, but for Ubuntu. Who is that instruction, as it were, directed to? And so I want to amplify some of these problems. This panic about black rage is a permanent panic of a racialized white supremacist settler colony, because, you know, the fact of the matter is that the historical problem is still in motion. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's part of my interest in the native problem as a kind of political rationality that shifts over time across different times and spaces.
There we go. No, fantastic. Yes, there seems to be this lingering sort of the swart gevaar constantly on the rise, never quite able to quell it. I see that we have 3 hands raised. Perhaps we can just field all 3 questions and then, you know, see what time that takes us up to. We are 20 past 2, so let's just keep that in mind, those asking questions, so that we can have a little bit more time for Prof. Modiri to speak back to us. So let me see here. It's Professor Double, Dr. Tayob, and then there was another hand. So please, can you go ahead, Dr. Tayob?
I think Paul had the hand up before me. So.
Okay. Oh, there we are. Now I've clicked back to my page. Yes, go ahead, please, Paul Ndaba.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Modiri. So my question really has to do with considering the, you know, settler colonial violence as the beginning of South Africa. what would you say to the idea that regardless of sort of historical moments in South Africa, such as transition in '94, that anti-blackness would forever be permanent, or is forever permanent, that it's a condition that that we would have to live with, regardless of whether there's black political power or changes in leadership. And that brings me to the second question, that there are people who've in the past have been interested in kind of doing the work of that is dedicated towards salvaging something out of the Constitution. But you seem to be advancing a different idea, that we need to entirely undo that or abolish that. I mean, it sort of goes on to become something else, such as black nihilism. So do you think to solve the problem of anti-blackness, there is something to be said about the role of the Constitution itself? Does it have the potential to contribute towards undoing South Africa, considering what South Africa is and its essence historically? Thank you.
Thank you, Mpho. Shahid, do you want to go ahead?
Okay, thanks so much. Thanks, Joel, for your talk. I thought it was obviously really brilliant, right? The way you bring in a lot of things which scholars in humanities don't want to talk about, right? Things brute. Often they want to avoid materiality, war, conquest. You bring in the material in. You're also bringing an alternative gaze, right? You're actually bringing an archive that looks in different directions. And I think that is I'll get to that later. And I really loved obviously bringing Smuts and Sobukwe into this, because it's a historical texture, and I totally buy your analytic. I just have a few small points. So the first is, I wonder whether it's useful. I come from the anthropology of religion. Sorry, my name is Shahid Tayyab. We'll meet someday, I'm sure. I'm a friend of Dumisona. But I come from the anthropology of religion. So the idea of prophetic is, for me, it's selling short. I see this as actually just a very, very, these are people who are theorizing from an embodied material location, and they are incredibly astute, philosophically, intellectually, right? So the critique of multiculturalism that Sobukwe brings forward, I think of this as actually needs to be included in an archive of multicultural studies as a kind of a way of understanding the critique of it. And we had a guest here, a good friend, his name is Demetrius Udall. Okay, I can share that with you. He writes about multiculturalism in the US and its links to slavery. And I think there's something, he actually incidentally is a student of Sylvia Wynter in the 80s. So this is quite an interesting connection you're picking up. And it reminds me of, this question of the archive. Your talk also alerted me to the second point, to the methodological nationalism. I find it quite interesting that you reference the Comoros before, right, their early work, which is done during apartheid, which is very critical, of the way that power works. You fast forward 20 years later, they're talking about capital, millennial capital. Now all of a sudden, it's almost like the native is busy doing it to themselves. Well, we know it's capital, but their idea of this late capitalism is not even there, So actually, it's all ephemeral. So now they're doing it to themselves. And this is very important. But also alongside that, there's the critique, I think you mentioned it, the critique of the nation. So at least in a lot of these critical disciplines, you have a critique, very critical, right, of what apartheid is doing to black subjects. Apartheid ends, and suddenly it's a critique of what the state is failing. So there's a kind of a methodological nationalism. There was always the possibility that they could have written about what the new state, what the old subjects were doing. There could have been a turn to that, to say, okay, what about these people who are, but so there's something there's a methodological nationalism going on in general in South Africa. And I think that is a paper and a project that needs to be written also, and we can discuss this sometime, because obviously, this debate in India, all over the world, methodological nationalism, we have our own unique take on this, and I think it's really important. So you just alerted us to this. Interestingly, and again, just because you mentioned the material, really important, there's still the fantasy in South Africa going around that raises an idea, it's not material. And as of now, we're going to get rid of ideas. So anyway, that is a small little thing. The whole field needs to change. What I really liked about your paper, and it's a theme I want to pick up on, see, there's a way, again, just very quickly, the way that a lot of scholarship in South Africa tries to bridge this problem of race is through aspiration, right? Look at Black people. They want to dress like us. That goes all the way to Gluckman. That's supposed to be radical for them, like, oh, they want to be like us. But it's modernization theory, right? And then after post-apartheid, we have this idea that, oh, no, wait, they all want to consume and they want to, but they want to consume in ways apparently as if the white is not there. So obviously, but the aspiration is the bridge. And I think, obviously, because of critical race theory, you bring into anxiety. And it's so obvious, right? This archive in South Africa, recently there's a paper on ghost stories. In fact, my sister who wrote it, but fascinating. Anxieties in the 20th century that slave owners have, ex-slave owners have of the slaves walking in the corridors in the Cape. And you find this in America in the ex-slave owning places, and the Swart Kafar is such an obvious, they literally created this idea. So I think you're taking us from aspiration, which is a bankrupt idea, and you're taking us to anxiety, which is far more productive. Finally, I think it's just a general question. As I'm listening to you, I'm thinking subaltern studies, right? I'm thinking of an entire tradition, right? A school, right? That basically comes along and says, actually, you know what? It's not working. The way you're studying capital, their thing was capital, their thing was industrialization. So, and maybe I know you can't answer this, but I want to push in this direction of going forward. This sounds to me like this is the start of a school. This is the start of a school which goes beyond political theory. And it needs to also take root in anthropology, in sociology, because if we keep on producing, so what the subaltern studies did was they targeted history, but actually the effects have gone into other fields. So I'm very excited about this, and hopefully we'll have you back in a few months' time to think about more. Yeah. Anyway, thanks. I don't have a specific question. I think it is something to think with. Some great idea. Thank you.
Thank you, Shahid. Sorry, final. This is one last hand, and I think actually, if there aren't any more hands, I think we're going to have to call it a day on this, and certainly hopefully have you invited back later. But Bernard, do you want to go ahead and ask your question, so that and please could you make it as brief as you can, Bernard, so that we can give a chance to Joel to answer. Thanks.
Thank you for a very stimulating conversation and paper. I'm sorry I can't turn my camera on. There's too much going on here. But two very brief questions. One, I'd like you to speak a little bit more to the radical wing of the Congress tradition, and particularly I'm thinking about Chris Hani, Mzala Kumalo, Bernard Magubani to some extent, although he was maybe had a more peripheral role. The theory of internal colonialism and colonialism of a special type that I think, does this complicate your overall map? And in particular, we know of the long dialogue of members of the Communist Party with Cuba, China, Soviet Union, their theoretical discussions with Leninist traditions and with, Angola and Mozambique in terms of liberation. So I'm curious about that and whether it's easy to subsume some of the more radical elements of the Congress tradition or more radical elements of the Communist Party within the general frame, and whether any adjustments have to be made. So that's question one. Question two is, I get the argument, and I think it's a very persuasive argument that the political legal order based on the native problem and settler colonial violence, foundational settler colonial violence that to some extent continues to maintain white supremacy and provides the dialogue for or the basis of the relationship between the first and the second New South Africa, as you call them. But I'm wondering if the social and economic drivers of these different formations are the same. So if I can accept the political and legal arguments about continuity, but if the early 20th century kind of colonial state was expansionist, extractive, labor intensive, it seems today that we're facing a global capitalist order that looks quite different. So then the question is, what is the relationship between the form of capitalism, if you want racial capitalism that we face today, and continued white supremacy? And is it the same, or do we have to think about shifts? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can I answer, Ifua?
Certainly. please go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for those questions. Some of these, as you know, will probably go unanswered, or at least not satisfactorily. Let me start with the question that Mpondawa poses around the permanence of racism. And you know, when people hear this term, they immediately evoke, you know, black theories of pessimism, familiar to most people as either Afro-pessimism or black nihilism. But I would return us to an older tradition, at least, well, a tradition that acquires clarity in the 1970s in the work of someone like Derek Bell, who also argued what he called the permanence thesis, or the thesis that racism would be permanent as a necessary component in the United States. So in other words, I don't see him as making a temporal argument that racism is a transhistorical permanent formation. But he was saying that in order for the United States as a polity built on slavery and colonial domination to exist in the basic foundation, structure, and conditions in which it exists, racism would be a permanent component or a necessary component of the kind of the continuation of that. And I think, indeed, as I point out, colonial intellectuals also had that understanding that racism, in the structural guise at least, would have to be a permanent component of South Africa, because it's through racism that the division of black and white acquires any meaningful material meaning. And so I would, you know, I would not, so even if it has resonances with, you know, either the Calvin Warren project or the Afro-pessimism project, I actually think that within critical race theory, remember this is where my project started, that the work of Derek Bell has not been sufficiently accounted for in thinking about what he understood by the permanence of racism. Yeah, I mean, I have been working with a typology regarding the Constitution of three dominant approaches, what I would call constitutional optimism, constitutional skepticism, and constitutional abolition. And my argument is very briefly that optimism and skepticism are both South Africanist modes of analysis, whereas abolitionism is an Azanian mode of analysis. I'm not saying it's not a useful question to ask about how to augment the Constitution to make it capable of realizing as radical as possible a meaning. I'm simply saying that's not an abolitionist or decolonization project, and that's a project that's likely to anyway come face to face with the historical political foundations of society and will come to ring hollow, which I think is what's happening. So the argument is that the way the philosophical historical making of the Constitution is fundamentally inconsistent with with black people's historical claims to justice, and that it involves a crucial sacrifice of black people's claims to justice. And so that what we would need is an entirely new process of reconstitution if we are to make sense of this problem. And that has to do with shifting away from thinking of the problems as being poverty, unemployment, corruption, maladministration, to actually saying there's something in the very foundations of South Africa that is generating the contradiction itself. Then Shahid, yeah, thank you for those comments. I'll say a few things. I mean, I think we need to think about, and as you know, both in the Pan-Africanist tradition, in the Black radical traditions, the emphasis on political spirituality and even political theology in a way. I'm thinking about prophetic here in the sense that people like Cornel West and Tony Bogues have thought about it. This idea of intellectuals who are not only speaking in their time, what you're calling the embodied moment, but who are actually fundamentally concerned with futurity and with what will come after that. They're speaking to a next generation. And a lot of these predictions and these speculations that they make, many of which in the Black radical tradition have panned out almost exactly as they imagined. I want to think about them as prophetic because often in contemporary social theory, there's this argument that Black consciousness is an old theory, it's not fit for the new South Africa. And the argument of the prophetic character of it is that it was always already Black consciousness speaking to the new South Africa, or the second new South Africa, as I'm calling it. In other words, it's not necessary to reinterpret. There are aspects of Black consciousness, of Pan-Africanism, of Lembede's thought, of Garvey, of Malcolm X, and so on and so forth, which is directly speaking to the time to come. It's also linked to the argument I'm trying to make as well, that this idea that the Black radical tradition is not interested in futurity, in an openness to the future, that there's a stuckness in the past, in an atavistic or past model of Africa or whatever. Not true. They constantly, they had a much more dynamic relationship to time. But I don't disagree that they were not, also just astute, intelligent thinkers who just could read the time, who had whose analysis had better explanatory power. Then thank you for the point on methodological nationalism. I certainly think that one of the things that happens in the New South Africa is exactly, or in the second New South Africa, is exactly the emphasis, the gaze on the state, which is a continuation of the native problem. It's that, okay, now the natives are in power, let's see what they're going to do. But of course, as it were, the instruments of white power, especially law is a very powerful instrument, are always available to restrain the native failure, native proclivities. I think that, and so what we've seen is a complete erasure or removal from the table of the question of the beneficiaries or rather, let me call them the historical oppressors in South African society. They're no longer an object of study. And that has to do also with a very state-centric understanding of power lying only in the state. But I think one of the major innovations of the post-1994 remaking of this Smuts Botha project was actually to give up political power in favor of maintaining what Ali Mazrui calls, give up the crown but keep the jewels. And I think that is itself a very important shift in the mode of white supremacist governmentality in South Africa. And we have a number of movements in South Africa that are openly denying racism as a problem. And part of that is because of the ways in which racism has disappeared as a structuring category of analysis in a lot of scholarship. Either race is secondary to class, or race is seen as an ideal discursive thing. Race is in our minds, race is about feelings. People talk about racial divisions and no longer talk about racial structures, racial domination. People talk about racist feelings, racist behavior, and no longer racist outcomes, racist disparities. And I think we need to shift that language, and that's both what critical race theory and Black radicalism offers us to do. Then on the question on subaltern studies, I guess that whether you're talking about subaltern studies or decoloniality or Afro-pessimism or Black studies in the US, I think that South Africa as a political theoretical case study presents a lot of openings for these theoretical innovations to engage the South African reality. But I also think that South Africa also exposes some of the limits of subaltern studies, of decoloniality, of US Black studies, and mainly because of the minoritarian register of many of those approaches, of this idea of speaking from the periphery or from the margin, which the Azanian tradition repudiated. They wanted to speak from the center, and they wanted the narratological aesthetic of their politics to insist on their majority status and on their centrality. But yeah, those are all very useful points, and I hope we can take them offline and have some further discussion on them, including the text around anxiety, because I do think that the political and economic logics of colonial domination and of racial power have a very powerful affective psychological element, which again was pointed out by the Azanian tradition, right? It was called the superiority complex, but superiority complexes also produce anxieties about the collapse of that superiority. And so I think it is important to also mark out the affective elements of this. Then to the last question, yes, I think that's quite correct. As I pointed out, even the ANC Youth League of the 1940s, even the Pan-Africanist Congress, even the Group of Eight, they all came out of the ANC. So it seems to me that one of the things that might be interesting to trace in the ANC is how the ANC regularly cleanses itself of its most radical elements, that it gives birth to this diverse set of traditions and constantly tries to return to the center. That to me is a consistent, whether you're talking about the Africanists or the communists, they don't last in the ANC. And of course, we know the fate of Chris Hani in relation to the negotiation and all the speculation around that. But let me just say that I'm not sure. I think that for me, the question of radicality is determined by one's orientation to the South African political foundations, and to the extent that the ANC, including some of the radical leftists within the ANC, Chris Hani and so forth, the fact that they nonetheless remain committed to radicalizing the Charterist promise, for me, would question the status of their radicality. I mean, obviously, they wanted more change. They wanted something more fundamental. They were challenging the negotiated settlement. But I think that for me, the radical moment must begin with the repudiation of the Charter. But nonetheless, I agree with you that the point is not to say there are no radical elements in the ANC or that there were no radical elements in the ANC. It's to say that the ANC has had a very good way of dulling down the radical energies within it or expelling it if those energies threatened to become the dominant voice. So I'm saying that the dominant political, intellectual thread of the ANC has always been the moderate one, with a few interruptions and adjustments that we might call radical in relation to the ANC's position, but which are quickly dealt with here. And of course, we know also the fate of people like Tennyson Makiwane and some of the politics around political violence that emerged in MK and in exile, which is another area that needs to be explored. Simply to say that I'm fully in agreement with you about the idea that the first and new South Africas were determined by very different socio-economic, economic climates, different grammars of political economy. That's maybe less my own interest. All I was trying to show is that the first and new South Africa are in an important continuum that is both material and discursive at the level of the political logics that subtend the making of South Africa. And that's why it was not tongue-in-cheek for me to insist that the ANC or the Congress tradition must claim at least Jan Smuts as one of its founding fathers, because they drew fundamentally from the textbook of white nationalist politics, and unwittingly therefore preserved some of the essential elements of that project, in my view. Those are all unsatisfactory answers, but I hope that they get the conversation started. And indeed, I very much welcome an invitation to Stellenbosch in living color, so that we can have some kind of extensive engagement on these issues. But I thank you again, Efua and the department for this invitation. And I certainly hope that the conversation will continue in the coming weeks.
Yes, thank you so much for gracing us with your presence and your thought. I've left with reams of notes that I've taken going forward. So thank you as always for just stoking that inner fire. And yes, I look forward to taking this conversation further. We will be in touch certainly. And yeah, thank you everybody for your ears, for your time. Once again, if you want to make reference to the presentation today, it is available via our YouTube channel. So do sound like a TV host. Please do go to the channel and see it there. I did note that there was a hand up from Velelo, Lucanio Velelo, but please do go ahead and feel free to contact Professor Modiri there after the session. Okay, so that's it for the afternoon. Thanks again, and we look forward to having you back here at Stellenbosch.
Thank you very much. Have a good afternoon.
Okay then.
Thank you.